quite excited about this chance to give this presentation here. Right, so this will be quite a technical presentation, and it's basically the type of presentation that I like the most. So I hope you do too. All right, let's go. So I'll share my screen. And here we go. All right. So this talk's going to be about how to use extensions, Magento extensions, with the Hyvä front-end theme. And it's a common question that I hear when I'm working with people who just start working with Hyvä. Then, building a site, and we all use extensions. That's one of the big superpowers of Magento, these vast pool of extensions that we have at our disposal. So if we have an extension that's built for the Luma front-end stack, the question is, how can we use that with a completely different front-end or partially different front-end, like, Hyvä, for example. So the answer, as most of you maybe already know, or maybe not, I don't know, is compatibility modules, right? So the idea is to create an additional module that replaces those part of the Luma code in a module with Hyvä compatible ones. So normally it's just a bunch of PHTML files that override the other files from the Luma module. And it's actually not that hard, right? So normally with Luma, we have PHTML files, of course, layout XML, but that actually stays the same. And we have less files for the styling, and we have JavaScript files, usually quite a number of those, lots of small JavaScript files. And then we have knockout templates.html files. And when we want to make all that compatible with Hyvä, basically we just inline everything into PHTML files. So it's quite simple that far. But of course, let's go a step deeper, because it's different technologies. So how does it actually look? Well, PHTML files change a little, because in Hyvä we use HTML5. So all the nice new browser capabilities that weren't around 5 years ago or longer ago, we use them, because now we can rely on them being there. Now that finally Internet Explorer 11 support has been dropped almost universally. So that's a thing, and it makes that alone already reduces the amount of code that needs to be written by a lot. All right. And then there's the styles, so less files. Hyvä doesn't use less. It doesn't use Sass either. Instead, it uses Tailwind CSS, which is a utility CSS framework. And what happens basically is there are many small classes that all get inlined into the HTML and reused all over the place instead of writing custom classes. It's more common to reuse these existing utility classes. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a little while. And then the JavaScript that gets converted from this big complex stack that Magento uses, right? With knockout and jQuery and jQuery widgets and underscore and require.js, all that's gone. Instead, we just use vanilla JavaScript, and where needed, a bit of Alpine JS. And that's more than enough to work with an e-commerce site, it turns out. It's a very lightweight, fast stack there. And for the HTML templates, the knockout remote templates, those also basically get inlined. So far, I've never found a need to render an external HTML file. So those HTML files were mainly used to render client-side render, personalized information. But yeah, it's pretty much always possible to do the same thing, just inline. All right. So let's have a bit, closer look at the individual parts there. So the steps when building a site and we want to use a module are as follows, right? First of all, check the compatibility module tracker. So it's basically an issue board on our GitLab. And every issue in that project represents a module, right? And a module can be requested, that's just a fresh new issue, or it could be in process, that means it's being developed, or it could be published, which means, a compatibility module already exists. Now, if we look at all the tens of thousands of Magento instances out there, we'll find that many of them share a bulk of compatibility modules, right? So there are some that are used by a very large number of Magento instances, and then it's kind of like this long tail, right? And then there are a lot of extensions that are just used in a few sites, and of course there also are a lot of bespoke extensions that are custom built for one specific Magento instance, and well, those probably won't be there in the compat module tracker, but the process of making them compatible is the same. Anyway, chances are, if you want to use a compatibility module or if you're looking for a compatibility module for an existing extension, it might already exist. So check the compatibility module tracker first. Now, if there isn't an extension, a compatibility module, then open an issue. That basically means, hey, I need this compatibility module, and maybe somebody else would like to share the workload, or maybe somebody else might chime up and say, hey, we already got this, we just didn't add the record in the tracker yet. So the idea here is to share the work, and that way we all win, right? So that's actually quite good. It's also possible to maybe sometimes find alternatives. So you might be looking at extension A that does something, but there's also extension B, which covers the same functionality. And maybe extension B already has a compatibility module. So worth a look. Right. And by the way, I'll publish these slides later on SlideShare. So if you want to look them up, no problem. Okay, so let's assume you want to use a module and there isn't a compatibility module available yet. Maybe it's a bespoke module, right? So the first thing to do then is to request a skeleton compat module from one of the Hyvä theme in our Slack. And to do that, we need two pieces of information. We need the original module name, the Magento name, and the original module composer package name. And then we can run our little script, and it will generate a repo with this skeleton compat module stuff in there. So what's in there? What does a skeleton module contain? Not a lot, just a bit of boilerplate. But there are two files there that I want to point out, and that's the composer.json file, and there's the di.xml file in etc frontend. So let's have a look at those. So in the composer.json file, we have a dependency on the original module, right? So that would be the module that this compatibility module is for. And there's also a dependency on Hyvä theme's Magento 2 compat module fallback. And that's basically what gets used by this di.xml boilerplate. That's what's in there in this etc frontend di.xml, right? So here, some constructor arguments for a CompatModuleRegistry is configured. And what this is it's a mapping from compatibility modules to original modules and from original modules to compatibility modules. And it's not a one-to-one mapping necessarily, right? So we could have multiple compatibility modules all covering the same original module. So maybe each one covers a different part of the functionality of the original module. But it also could be that one compatibility module covers multiple original modules, because sometimes extension vendors split their extensions into multiple modules, and it doesn't really make sense in some cases to create individual compat modules for each one, right? So it's quite flexible, and that's already taken care of right there. The question is, of course, what is it good for to have this mapping, right? What does this CompatModuleRegistry do? Well, there's one thing. It provides automatic template overrides. So here is an example, right? So if we have a template in the original module, for example, in Smile Elasticsearch Catalog, there's a template, view frontend templates, layer view PHTML. Now, if I copy this template into the same location in the compatibility module, then thanks to the automatic template override, Magento will automatically use the compatibility module version of the template instead of the original. If and only if the currently requested front-end theme is a Hyvä theme. So it doesn't interfere with any Luma-based storefronts that might still exist at the same time. And because compatibility modules can cover multiple original modules, there's also an alternative path that can be used, which is the same path, only with the small Elasticsearch catalog folder, like the name of the original module is there in the path too. So that way it's possible to split overridden templates, just make it more descriptive which templates they belong to, or maybe two original modules share the same template file name, and then we would need this this layer of indirection there to be able to distinguish them. So of course all of this would be possible just with layout XML too, but it just makes it a bit more comfortable. It reduces the amount of boilerplate we would need to have to write here. All right, so what other tools do we have at our disposal while writing compatibility modules? One thing that's really useful is to have a Luma reference store available while doing this, right? So I always create a second store view where just the default Luma store is running. And then I open that store view in a private browsing window in the browser and switch to the Luma store there. And then I can have the Luma store view and the Hyvä store view side by side and see what the extension is actually supposed to be doing and look like in the Luma store while I'm working on reproducing that in the Hyvä store. So that's kind of handy to be able to switch back and forth there. And the way we can then make changes to how the module behaves on the front end of the Hyvä store is through a mechanism called Hyvä Prefix layout updates. So let's say on a page request to a Luma store, maybe if a customer is editing their address, there are 3 layout update handles that get applied to a page. Default, as always, customer address edit for that specific action, and customer account. Now, if Hyvä is active, there are some additional layout handles. So each of the original ones, but with a Hyvä underscore prefix. So Hyvä default, Hyvä customer address edit, and Hyvä customer account are merged in as well. And that only happens if the current store view is a Hyvä store view. So any layout declarations we add there won't be applied on Luma stores that might still be active at the same time. So that also allows us to override changes that have been made in a theme from a module layer, because otherwise themes always win over declarations in modules. So just saying, that's quite handy to use in compatibility modules. In general, in a compatibility module, I only would use the Hyvä prefix version of a layout handle, not the originals. Okay, now some modules also require changes outside of templates. Maybe, I don't know, many reasons. And in such cases, those adjustments in Magento are usually done with observers or plugins. So it might be necessary to figure out if the current store view that's being rendered or being presented to the customer is running Hyvä or not in PHP code, so outside of a template. And that's possible with this little service class called current theme. And it has one method called isHyva. So we can then use that method in an observer or plugin to only do our work if Hyvä is active, for example. So now that's just a bit of high-level overview. So how does it actually look like working through making a compatibility module? So the first thing that usually happens after I install a Luma module and open a Hyvä store view is I see an error message in the browser console. The second one is here that I'm after. Reference error require is not defined. And the reason for that is that in Hyvä there is no require.js. So this happens if the module uses an inline require call to load some JavaScript. And if the module does everything according to, well, the Magento official recommended way using xMagento init or datamage init, then I won't see any error message at all. That's also common, but of course, those declarations wouldn't be parsed in a Hyvä theme, so just nothing happens basically, right? Just stuff is missing on the page. So what do we do then? Well, it's a step-by-step process. First, I'll choose a page, maybe the product detail page or whatever page I want to start working on for that specific module, that wherever it adds some functionality. And the first step is I copy that template into my compatibility module. And then I need to rewrite the JavaScript, if there is any, and I need to rewrite the styles, if any. And once that's done for that template, then I'll move on to the next template, maybe on a different page, maybe on the same page. It really depends on the module in question, right? So how does this look like? Let's look at rewrite JavaScript and rewrite styles in a little more detail. Now, there are many different ways how JavaScript is applied in Luma. So basically what it always boils down to is we want to take that functionality that was written for Luma using the whole Magento JavaScript stack and recreate that functionality using vanilla JavaScript or Alpine JS. And there also is the case of external JavaScript libraries, and I'll talk a bit more about that soon too. So in case of vanilla JavaScript, so maybe the code in question doesn't really have a lot of Magento specific functionality, right? Except that it's wrapped into require.js modules. In that case, often it's enough to just inline it into the page, into a script tag, and initialize it with a DOM content loader event listener. For example, something like this on the slide, right? So as soon as the page is loaded, we'll execute that logic. And that is quite common actually for modules that don't interfere with the DOM a lot, right? So they might only add some tracking, like in this example here, right? They check for query arguments or cookies or whatever, but they don't make the page more interactive in any way. So yeah, that's kind of common. So that's how I would typically initialize some vanilla JavaScript on a Hyvä page. And then there's other JavaScript code that does interfere a lot with the DOM. Maybe there's toggles and modals and all kind of stuff. Form validation. Quite often in Luma, those would be jQuery UI widgets. Those are the most common, or knockout view models. So in those cases, I tend to transfer them and rewrite them as Alpine JS. Instead of just vanilla JavaScript. And the way that works is we once again inline the logic into a function like here, init checkout gift cards. And then to whatever that returns, it returns an object, but to make that the Alpine component logic, or sometimes I call it Alpine View Model, we add this xData annotation to the div. And you might recognize that's very similar to Vue.js if you're familiar with it. So the syntax is pretty much the same with some very minor differences. So you might feel right at home there. And even if you're just coming from Knockout, it's not too different from using data bindings, to be honest. So anyway, we initialize it, and then we can add, for example, event observers with @ So here, @private content loaded would listen for the private content loaded event, and with .window, that event listener will actually be added to the window instead of to the DOM element. And whenever that event is triggered, we'll have the callback receive section data with the event detail data that get passed in, right? So that would be a method here on this Alpine component that gets returned from the init checkout gift cards. And then we have additional observers like on click or key down, enter. That's when the enter key is pressed while the focus is on the div, etc. So it's usually quite straightforward to transfer them. And the idea is to use all of this inline. So instead of with Magento, where we have the JavaScript in one file and the PHTML or HTML file in another, everything's together. The tricky thing is only if they get too large, then it gets, there are ways to deal with this. Of course, it's nicer to split things up then. But as long as things don't grow too much, it's actually super nice to have everything in one file. It's right where we want it. And if it grows larger, then the most common approach is either to just split it into sub PHTML templates or, also split it, but we still have the choice whether we want to keep everything in the scope of one Alpine component, or if we actually want to split it into multiple Alpine components, which also is an option. When we want to have multiple Alpine components communicate with each other, usually we do that with events. Excuse me. Right. So that's usually how we rewrite JavaScript with that does stuff with the DOM. And then finally, we have external JavaScript libraries, because quite often there might be some SDK provided by, I don't know, payment provider or other integrations. And we want to use those because they make our life a lot easier, so we don't have to rewrite everything. And the code there isn't Magento specific at all, right? So in Magento, commonly they are just added with a script tag, maybe before body end or something. But the problem with these external JavaScript libraries is that they quite often negatively impact our core web vitals score. And it might not be a good idea to just add a script tag that always pulls that in, especially if it's rather large. And even more so if that then starts messing with the DOM in some way. So we might end up with layout shifts and so on. So the way I like to deal with this is to only load these external JavaScript files when they're actually needed. So here's an example of that I used with live chat widgets. So instead of just pulling in that live chat widgets, and they're famous for making a site score go down, I might only load it on first user interaction. So on mobile, that would be a touch start event or a mouse over event, maybe for desktop. And only when that happens, then we load the script tag, and to initialize the logic and start executing it, it's possible to add, for example, a load observer to the script on load observer. And if we want to avoid layout shifts, it's nice to provide like a fake hard-coded widget out of the box, just and just replace that with the real one once the JavaScript has been loaded later. And it doesn't always have to be on user interaction. Maybe it makes more sense to load some JavaScript when an element gets clicked or gets focused or whatever. So that's the way to deal with external JavaScript libraries in a way that doesn't negatively impact our site. Now, rewriting the actual JavaScript then, once now we know how to put it onto the pages, but most of the time with Magento, it actually is just taking jQuery and replacing it with vanilla JavaScript, which is super straightforward, but many people don't know this. So me included, when I started working with Hyvä, I was so used to working with, well, the Magento way of doing things. It's like, it feels foreign at first, but a lot of the functionality that was back in the day, we needed jQuery to do these things, now exists natively in the browser. So we really don't need jQuery anymore. Right? We can do everything we do with jQuery. We can do it natively, and it even looks very similar. It might not be quite as terse, but it's still the same thing. There's this great website here. You might not need jQuery.com. And if you ever run into some functionality in jQuery and you can't find a native version of that jQuery function, it's worth looking for the site, and they might just have a small, 4-liner or 5-liner of code that you can then use to recreate that jQuery functionality without having to pull in all of jQuery. For GraphQL or for Ajax, that's used a lot, of course, too. Instead of using jQuery Ajax, which is what's commonly done in Magento, Luma, we use Fetch, native browser window fetch, and well, it can do anything that we would usually do with jQuery there. On the Hyvä documentations, we have a page with many examples how to do posts and GET requests with a JSON body or a form post or GraphQL requests, etc. So yeah, that's just another little thing. Getting used to it is not more difficult than learning the jQuery.ajax syntax. In fact, once you're used to it a little bit, it's super consistent. So it's actually really nice working with it. Then there are some little utility methods provided by Hyvä, because they're so commonly used on pretty much every page. There's so Hyvä, that's a global variable. You can access it from anywhere. It's on the window object. And there's get cookie and set cookie. and get browser storage, which deals with this few inconsistency on Safari Mobile. There's post form, which allows us to just take a jQuery object and post it as a form, key value pairs. And a get form key, again, useful for doing any kind of AJAX requests that involve post requests. And rendering prices, right? So there's format price. Now, one bigger difference that we might run into is when dealing with customer section data. If you're not familiar with it, this is what Magento uses in Luma to render customer-specific data, while with JavaScript, render it client-side, while the full page is still being served out of the full page cache. So this customer section data then gets stored in the local storage in the browser and gets refreshed only when needed. In Luma, we would request specific parts of the customer section data. For example, I want the customer and the cart, right? And each of them are treated as their own little things. And, we would add observers there or use, usually with knockout, it would use them in knockout bindings. So it automatically re-renders whenever these values change, etc. In Hyvä, we do these things differently. In Hyvä, on every page, there's one event that gets dispatched called private content loaded. And the payload of that event is all the customer section data, all of it. So in many modules, what I've seen is that it is a lot of logic to synchronize different parts of the section data. So if the customer changes, I do this, and then the cart needs to be updated, and then I also get that part. And that actually leads to a lot of requests to the section data endpoints. And it actually costs a lot of resources and slows pages down, makes things kind of sluggish. So by using this approach here, we don't have to worry about that. And I often found that the amount of code required to do this kind of dealing with multiple parts of the customer section data, instead of 100 lines, it boils down to maybe 10. It makes things a lot simpler. And we just pull out those parts of the section data that we actually need in whatever logic we want to add, right? And another thing that Luma has is this automatic invalidation of customer section data. So in the configuration server side, we can map specific parts of the customer section data to actions. And whenever a post or delete method request is sent to the server, the browser automatically invalidates or reloads part of the customer section data. Again, all this logic that was written with the intent of reducing the overhead has been dropped from Hyvä. Instead, there's just a single event, reload customer section data, that we can dispatch in case we want to reload any part of the customer section data. Turns out this simplification makes everything a lot faster. Complexity isn't actually always needed to make things quicker or more lightweight. Sometimes simpler approaches do have a lot of performance benefits. So again, Hyvä is all about keeping things simple, and that's just another representation thereof. Okay, so that takes care of just a quick overview of how we can deal with JavaScript in Hyvä. Now let's have a look at styles. In Hyvä, we use this Tailwind classes. And so up here is an example for the compare products link, how it looks in the default Luma store. So we have the classes compare, wrapper, item link compare, action compare, no display. That's how it would look in Luma. And in Hyvä, instead we have classes like flex, item center, order 3, relative, invisible, inline block, mx1, that's margin on x axis 1, so left and right, no underline, etc. So these are the utility classes, and we just use them in line. The big benefit of these utility classes over the traditional approach that Luma uses is we tend to use the same utility classes on most pages. There might be some that are used only on specific pages, but the bulk of them always are the same in different combinations. And what happens then is that when a production style bundle is built, only those classes that are actually used in the templates are included in the production CSS file. And when new pages are added, that production bundle doesn't grow anymore because it's just the same classes being reused again and again and again. Whereas with a traditional approach, with each new page and over time, the styles just grow and grow and keep getting larger and larger. And that's how it's possible to get these very small, just a couple of kilobytes often, style sheets that are used with Tailwind websites. And it works really well. And after getting familiar with the classes, it makes styling pages super fast. So for most templates, we would replace the styles that are default Luma styles. We replace them with standard Tailwind classes inline. Now, some modules also use external style scripts that also are declared with, written originally as less files and then compiled to CSS with the Magento compilation system, Grunt or PHP. And they might not be included in the standard styles M or styles L files because they maybe only are used on specific pages and such. So in Hyvä, the common approach is to just kick them out, remove those styles in layout XML, and replace them with inline Tailwind classes. And then, of course, some modules also use non-Luma specific CSS. Those are commonly bundled with JavaScript libraries. And in some cases, it might make sense to reuse these CSS codes, especially if you want to still use that external JavaScript library, right? A good thing to ask yourself there is that CSS used as part of the critical rendering path? So anything that's required to build the page above the fold, right? If so, maybe it's a good idea to replace those styles with Tailwind inline classes nevertheless, right? But if it's something that maybe is only used on specific pages or only after some user interaction happens, once again, it might be a good idea to just load that external CSS on user interaction, just like we did earlier with JavaScript, right? Or maybe that sometimes happens too. Maybe that CSS is only needed on a page where any Google Lighthouse scores or web metrics don't really matter, right? Maybe it's deep in the menu, building, configuring products or something. In those cases, sure, you can still just use it and don't worry about it. Okay, there's one tool that's really handy when converting Luma styles to Tailwind, and that's a browser plugin called Windy. It's from the guys at Beyond the Code. The website is usewindy.com. And what it allows us to do is right-click on a page somewhere while that extension is active and copy part of the DOM into the copy-paste buffer and then paste it into our template. And what it does is it replaces all the existing classes with the Tailwind classes. So when you paste, you already have the Tailwind classes in there that recreate that same visual representation that the other classes did previously. It doesn't, it's not perfect. So quite often there are some additional classes that aren't really needed because they might already be applied to parent elements, but it makes the whole process a lot quicker and more comfortable, especially if you're a beginner with Tailwind CSS. It's a commercial plugin. So I bought it for 49 euros, but it's super worth the money. And it's a great tool. All right, so we're almost done. And I'm a little over time, so 2 more slides, I think. One additional tool we use a lot in Hyvä, in the templates, are view models. View models are also used in Luma. The difference is in Luma, we have to inject view models into a block, into a template using layout XML. In Hyvä, we instead use a view model registry that's automatically injected into every PHTML template file in the variable view models. And then we use require to pull in the instance of the view model. So that decouples the template and makes it more self-contained and makes it easier to reuse it without having to move along things in layout XML at the same time. It's kind of like view helpers, just more lightweight and modern. And for example, here's the current product view model. So that would be handy anytime you want to render something on a product detail page. There's some methods on there for that. But some of the view models also are a bit richer. For example, there's a modal view model where we can simply create a modal, configure it, some contents, inline contents, or a template that should be rendered as the content of the modal dialog, add some additional values, and then we just can render it. And now we have a modal. So these view models are very handy, and there are quite a few as part of every Hyvä installation. Okay, so that's it. Sorry for going a little bit over time, but thanks for watching. If you did this live, great. That's awesome. If you're watching this on YouTube, that's great too. I don't think we have time, but for questions, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at Vinai Kopp, or maybe one of the Magento Slacks, or there's the website Hyvä.io. There's a contact form on there too. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Vinai, for this great presentation. We have a few questions for you.
Oh, and we have time. Great.
Yeah. So Paul is asking you, out of the currently complete compatibility modules, what are the top few you'd recommend to use as best practice references?
Sure. Okay, good question. So for sure, Elastic Suite, Smile Elastic Suite, that's just a wonderful module, and it works very well. And it's also used by many people as a replacement for many other partially commercial modules, like multiple selection in the layered navigation, like pages that are like category pages where you can select categories. You can do a lot with it. So that's a great one. Another one that's used a lot, of course, now is the page build integration. We're just in the process, though, of merging that compatibility module into the Hyvä default module and theme, because now that page builder is part of open source, there's no longer need to keep it actually as a separate compatibility module. Can't think of anything else right now. It really depends on the site then, I guess.
Okay. Another question from Paul. Any good material, blog, video, courses that goes into more details on using Alpine with Hyvä?
Jisse has a training on Hyvä development, so I guess he covers it in more detail. I don't know of any other material right now. We do have a lot of documentation, though. So in the Hyvä, all the license holders have access to our documentation site. And there's, I wrote a lot about it. Of course, not everybody likes to read that, but I tried to put all of that in more detail with examples into the docs. And you also have all the existing compatibility modules. You can look at how things are done there. And of course, we have an extensions channel in the Hyvä Slack. So feel free to reach out there with any concrete questions.
Okay, so one more question from Ivan. Any compatibility issues with old browsers, and when to use modern JavaScript instead of jQuery?
Well, we no longer support IE 11. So that was dropped since pretty much the beginning of the year in most of the internet. So unless you have some strong requirement to be compatible with old browsers, like some B2B sites, maybe, I'm not sure, but even there it's becoming quite rare. It depends on the customer in question, right? On the merchant in question. But in general, it's time to start using this more modern JavaScript. So that's, of course, a matter of opinion too. And depends on the customer in question, like I said, but I would not hesitate to use it in most cases. Just the amount of code we can drop by using modern JavaScript is great. Makes things a lot faster and easier.
Okay, so TB is asking you, do you have any concerns if Adobe will drop the Magento open source support? How you see the future of Hyvä in this case?
Right. So Magento, So Adobe won't drop open source support per se, right? So what it sounds like to me is rather like a slow starvation process where no more development effort goes into the open source core over a course of a few years. So that's, I don't know, 3 years or whatever. And at the same time, right now, you probably heard about this whole initiative to provide a long-term viable future with further development and maintenance, and to give the open source version and the PHP monolith a bright future there. And we're pretty excited in that regard because Adobe has been quite interested to work together on this. So I think it's going to be good. I don't envision any problems. In fact, it would be great if we had more control there, for example, for individual distributions, where one could choose maybe not to install the blank theme and the Luma theme at all, and then just use Hyvä, because that would make the whole installation even more lightweight, and we wouldn't even need the reset theme in Hyvä anymore. So yeah, the future is wide open there. Lots of options.
Okay, one more question from Yevgen. What will be the future features in Hyvä?
Oh, good one. So we are still working on covering all of the commerce features with compatibility modules. Actually, a lot of our partners are doing that on their projects. So every time a new B2B site is being built, more features are covered. So whatever is being needed for a given site. Sometimes we also just build features ourselves because they're heavily requested. There are some features and new things we will be presenting during Reacticon next week. So I don't want to give any spoilers here just yet. It's on the 14th is the Hyvä Day. So yeah, go there and have a look. And we have many ideas. Another big thing that's coming that's already known is we are building a UI component library. So that's based on PHTML templates. We released a couple of mega menus already, and after Reacticon, more will be released too, more different templates. So it makes it even quicker. So if you want to use a different footer or hero images, sliders, or any part, navigations, you can just drop in those pre-built high quality components as templates, just copy them into your theme and adjust them as needed for a site. So that should make building Magento sites even quicker than it already is with Hyvä.
Okay, and the last questions comes from Mihai. Can we implement Hyvä in EE?
In EE, that's Enterprise Edition, I guess.
Yeah.
Sure, no problem. There are many commerce sites using Hyvä already online. And again, the caveat there is not all the features that Adobe Commerce offers are covered already by compatibility modules. The most common ones are, plus some more rare ones, but maybe if you need something that isn't covered yet, you would maybe have to build that compatibility layer yourself. Or find somebody who's also working on that currently.
Okay. If you have any other questions, please jump in.
Awesome.
Okay, I think that's it for this session. Thank you all for being here.